Hello, everyone. My name is Preethi. I'm a UX researcher on the Jetpack Compose team.
And I'm Chris Sinco, UX design lead on the Jetpack Compose team.
Okay. In May 2019, we announced an early preview of Jetpack Compose, our modern UI toolkit designed to help build beautiful apps quickly and easily. And today, we are actually going to talk about how the community has helped evolve Jetpack Compose. So just to give a little bit of background, flash forward, we recently released the alpha version. Okay. Now, the Jetpack Compose team was very clear from the beginning that we invested in a developer-centered product and engaged with the community to gather feedback so we are building the right product for our developers. So UX research and design form the core of Compose's development right from its early stages. Now, the developer community has been very active in exploring and sharing feedback on the social channels, and this has been immensely helpful for the Compose team to sort of learn from developers' experience and make improvements. However, aside from this kind of community feedback that we have been getting from this organically rich developer ecosystem, our team does have a dedicated UX process. In today's talk, we will share how we applied user research and design principles to not only understand developers' needs and perceptions, but also apply our learnings to improve the product. Now, we'll share some stories on how we drew on research to sort of inform the product design. And in this process, we'll also talk a bit about some of the strategies that we had to adopt along the way to sort of be able to capture meaningful and actionable insights in this pretty complex space. Our hope is that this talk will shed some light on how your feedback has influenced improvements to Jetpack Compose. And we also hope that this talk will inspire you to adopt some of these strategies when applying user experience in your own product development, right? So a lot of companies do not necessarily focus on developer-centered research and design. But something that we would like to demonstrate in this talk is that the strategies that we will be sharing may be applied to consumer products as well. So let's get started. We would like to start by describing the framework we applied to this UX process, right? And the foundation of this framework is that we respect our users. And what this means is that it is very critical for us to have clarity on the primary user goals that we are attempting to solve. So we really wanted to ensure we were building on top of users' past experiences and expectations so that we were sort of maintaining this kind of continuity and offering for a more delightful developer experience. And built on top of this foundation are these three pillars that we have described in this figure here. Then this includes designing intuitive APIs, offering guidance that assists the developers to rapidly learn the concepts that are underlying Jetpack Compose, and also creating these tools that will support the consumption of these APIs. So today, what we are going to do is we are going to briefly share examples of how feedback from the community helped inform each of these pillars. At this point, I'm going to hand off to Chris to talk about how we designed a Compose tutorial.
Thanks, Preethi. One sec. So for the Compose tutorial, this is something that we had launched with the developer preview back in late 2019. With the intent of really being a quick intro for some of the early adopters of Compose and for those developers who are just curious to try it out, but not quite put in their apps. The idea was that we wanted to have a unique and modern experience on the site to help really folks jump into Compose with minimal commitment. And this is kind of different from some other guides or documentation types that we've put on developer.android.com before. But the approach wasn't just about the visuals, like making the UI look more modern or spacious, but it was actually about how we approached the guide itself, or the tutorial in this sense, in that we want to approach it differently, where we want to make improvements to how the content is structured, how it actually was paced, like as you go through the tutorial, and also just be more opinionated about for every step, what are the clear things that you should take away from each step as you go through the entire tutorial. And so before before we designed it, we actually had some prior research on some of the guidance work that we had done on developer.android.com, specifically for some of the Jetpack pages that some of you are familiar with. So in prior research, we found that developers, often they'll kind of skim content. They'll look for attention grabbers like bullet points or titles or big visuals. And so often for us, this just means we have to make sure that we have the right things on the page so that people can focus. People tend to skim for things like the words getting started or how to or about. The other thing is that, we found in previous research that developers are always looking for code snippets, since they want more and more code snippets, and that's how they best learn. And so that's kind of to the third point of hands-on learning with samples. And so with that in mind, we wanted to take all that into consideration of designing the tutorial for you. So approach was really, let's showcase what's possible with Compose without setup. And the second one was provide clear steps during and after learning. And the important one actually, yeah, that's fine. You can stay on the next slide. So I think first off in the design approach, talking to the second point before about providing clear steps. So the first thing is we want to make the goals and the organization of the tutorial really clear up front. So even before you skim, you can see very quickly at the top, like, here's what the tutorial is about. Here's what you expect to learn. One thing we thought about in the past, which we did take away, was like how much time it'll take. I think in the research I just mentioned before, developers did like it when there was a clear time for like how long this is going to take. I think though for the tutorial, we weren't exactly sure how long it was going to take, so we didn't want to overpromise on that. And then the other thing was kind of, you can see it with this GIF here where you zoom in. There was a clear outline of what the tutorial was, and also made it easy for you to scan and navigate through the tutorial at any time as you went through it. And so, the other part of the design that we did was, for every step, it was focused and progressive, and it had code. So we wanted to make sure that each step had a specific concept in it. And then with each one, there was code that was side by side. And because we're with Compose and building UI, we wanted to show you a preview of what you would actually see on the device. This all packaged together was really nice because you could learn the concept and see code snippets and the result of it without actually having to do anything in Android Studio. Of course, you could follow this tutorial step by step in Android Studio if you wanted to, but it was not required for you to learn about Compose. And so, based on the approach and some of the design ideas, we wanted to figure out, does this paradigm actually align with some of the developers' expectations, since we'd only done research on overall Jetpack guidance in some of developer.android.com, but not on this specific tutorial format. And so to test it, we had brought actually some participants into our San Francisco office. So Preethi, who's here in this presentation, was the researcher who conducted the studies. So with this format, we did in-person usability study. This is before COVID. And I think one of the protocols we usually do during the session is you think aloud, just so we understand like how you're navigating through things. And as you go along, if you get stuck, we'll ask you some clarifying questions, or if you do something that we think is interesting, we'll also ask some clarifying questions. And actually what is happening at the same time is that the rest of the product team is silently observing just to see how you are walking through the product. And so with the tutorial, I think the feedback was great and kind of resonated well with with the approach we were going for. So, this is kind of a summary of the feedback. So, users really liked the step-by-step approach, really working through examples, seeing the code side by side with the preview, focusing on the concept. It just made it very approachable and clear. But one thing we found from the research was the user was not clear exactly what to do after the tutorial when they were done. And so that feeds into the third part of the design that, one thing we incorporated into the tutorial was once you're actually done with it, we summarize what you learned through it, again, like from the top where we had the summary of the lesson. But we actually gave you a curated list of resources to look at next, specifically based on what you learned in the tutorial. So in this case, for example, you learned about layout and theming in the tutorial, and so we point you exactly to those follow-up reference documents. So in the future, we have a couple things we consider. I think the tutorial format was successful, so we want to figure out, should we continue to make more tutorials? Should it be more tutorials for Compose, or even other areas of Jetpack for new libraries or existing ones? The other thing that worked really well that developers liked is just there's no setup to actually learn anything. So, I think often today when we have code labs or samples, you have to use Android Studio and set up your development environment in certain ways, which can, conflict with how your machine is set up for working on whatever production app you're working on. And so people really appreciated that they could learn and not have to change the machine to do so. And so, one thing we're trying to think about is how can we expand that kind of experience to learning on other parts of Android developer technologies, like other libraries, other tools in the future. And then I think the third one, which is more of an expansion, is trying to figure out how can we do more contextual learning. So, once people read through these things online through code labs tutorials, how can we continue that learning within the project or the code they're actually working on? And so in that sense, we're trying to figure out how can we bring some of the guidance more directly closer to the source code. With that, we'll move on to the second feedback story, and I'll hand it off back to Preethi.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. So we'll now talk about how our team introduced modifiers and how some of the early feedback from the community influenced really critical changes to the API. And for that, we would have to time travel. So let's go back to maybe late summer of 2019. So early on, composables were used to specify how to lay out something. So for instance, in this example here, we would use a composable to add a padding around something like a text component, for instance. Right, so we wanted to actually validate that this API design aligned with developers' understanding when working with layout composables such as padding. And to do that, we sort of picked on a similar research approach that Chris just described with how we captured feedback on Compose tutorials. So it was very much in-person coding session with developers. So one of the things that we did in these sessions was that we provided a machine with a sample Compose project and Android Studio already set up. And whoever volunteered the time to participate in the study started off by reviewing something like a sample code. Following that, they would implement a design mock that was provided to them. Essentially, this basically involved adding more code to this sample project. And of course, they did this thinking aloud as they went about coding, so that it gave us a sense for where a developer was coming from. And we had the lab set up so that I, as the researcher, was basically present, acting more like this kind of talking fly on the wall. So I would ask clarifying questions while the rest of the team silently observed via a video call. Now, something that got called out very often in these research sessions was that padding as a component of its own is not very intuitive to how developers thought about padding in general. And some of this actually came from the classic view system, as this quote here, demonstrates that it's not very intuitive. And in addition, we also started to observe that it was unclear for developers as to how to implement padding in the first place. Right. So a common question that got raised was what would happen if one applied padding like in this example here. So will this padding be applied to both the text components? What about the text components? Are they going to be oriented vertically, or are they going to be oriented horizontally? So all of this sort of added to ambiguity. So what was happening here is that padding was operating in this context with multiple children, which sort of forces the developer to specify how the children has to be laid out. Right? But padding doesn't have the correct usage for it. And this sort of makes it difficult to differentiate padding from a column, for instance, in this example here. So this just made it much more ambiguous. Now, a key takeaway for our team from this research was that we had to rethink how Compose can help developers intuitively manipulate layout-related parameters. All of this sort of while ensuring that they wrote less code. Our fantastic engineering team landed on the concept of modifiers. Now, modifiers adapted this concept of layout params from the classic view system. And by that, what it did was it basically allowed for expressing padding as an object of its own, which can be passed as a parameter. So going back to the previous example we had before, we can now make padding as a modifier instead, and clearly we know now that the modifier has been applied to the column, which would take the space around both the text elements. Now, this provides for clarity and it simplifies the understanding, right? And it sort of also allows developers to change several of these modifiers to produce like a final measurement and a desired layout. So for instance, I have an example here. So the example here would read like, create like a text composable, fit it within like a layout of like 40 dp, add like a background color of solid green while ensuring the size of the text composable is within 20 dp. So one of the key concepts that was baked into this library was that the order in which the modifiers are specified matters. Now, the team was super excited about this new concept, and we were also interested to know what the community thought about it. Right? We knew that the idea of ordering modifiers can trip up developers until it is learned over time, but we still wanted to validate if modifiers as a concept can be grabbed. Right? We did uncover interesting insights that led to rethinking of modifiers, and I'll share a bit about that shortly. But before that, I would like to shed some light on what the UX team learned from this research. Right, the UX team also learned quite a bit that led to adopting new techniques for gathering developer feedback. Right? For instance, having developers explore and code in person was super valuable to our team. Right? So we were able to watch and learn how developers approached Android app development in general, using libraries and also specifically using modifiers. And this really opened up opportunities to have conversations on topics that we had originally not set out to learn. Right. However, this limited participation only to developers in the Bay Area. So in this case, this was primarily talking to developers in San Francisco. Now, indeed, this study sort of encouraged developers to spend like a quick 1 hour away from their work to share what they thought. In fact, we actually heard the feedback from several of the participants from these research sessions that they really appreciated being able to share their opinion and see it being reflected in the product a few months later. Right, having a machine already set up with this kind of development environment and a startup project to get started really quick was really welcomed by most participants. And we often heard loud and clear that it can take quite some time to set up the development environment before one can actually get started with experimenting or exploring Compose. But on the other hand, this form of gathering feedback did not really offer much room for developers to sort of play with the API for a good amount of time before they are able to share their feedback. So in trying to understand developers' reaction to modifiers, what we did was we took a different approach. Right? We wanted to hear developers' thoughts from around the world. And there was also this kind of need for balancing the time in having this kind of opportunistic conversations while also allowing time for developers to explore a concept before they are able to share and articulate their feedback. So we chose the homework paradigm where we asked developers to complete like small, like mini tasks that required the usage of Modifiers API over like a week. And following this, we invited them to have a video meeting where we'd have them share their code and have a deeper conversation about their experience. So let's go back to what we learned from the modifiers concept, right? So the very first first red flag that got called out was with the usage of the plus operator, right? There were many developers who associated plus with the concept of addition, so they were expecting to see something like a compound result. On the other hand, there were others who thought plus represented something like an overriding operation. And so they were expecting to see the code behave based on the most recent modifier item if there was like a list of modifiers chained together. Further, because plus was being commutative with like numbers, that was the concept a few developers were associating with. So because of that association, many assumed that the order actually did not matter, which was incorrect in this case, right? So for instance, in this code here, while some thought that replicating modifiers actually didn't make sense, so here we have draw background, which is being replicated twice. There were some that said, I wouldn't do that, I wouldn't write code in this manner. There were others who thought that this concept of adding modifiers would actually override. So in this case, the background color would either be solid green or it'll be solid blue-green, right? And it was very ambiguous. One other thing we observed was that developers expressed frustrations with indenting and like formatting long lists of modifiers. As expected, ordering was seen as confusing by most. We heard several talk about cognitive overload that this could potentially introduce in coding, not to mention the difficulties with knowing when order actually influenced the outcome. Now, modifier was perceived as a single entity, and hence most common feedback that we heard was that adding a modifier at the end will be very helpful, especially when someone wants to quickly iterate. Now, to make matters more complicated, we also heard the need for this kind of tooling support, right? So, for instance, the existing code completion and refactoring support was hindering the way one would manipulate the modifiers. So based on some of these takeaways, our team improved how modifiers allowed tweaking the presentation of a composable. What we did was we defined modifiers as Kotlin extension methods instead. By doing this, one can actually chain a bunch of these together to compose them. And this allowed for the opportunity for attaching callback events to composables by defining them within a modifier. So for instance, in this code here, there are like a bunch of modifiers that can be used together. And by using the concept of extension methods, what we did was essentially improve the namespace, right? So this assisted for better auto completion. Now, order still matters though. The explicit order helps one reason about how the different modifiers will interact, and it gives more control to achieve the exact behavior. Now, we're not actually going to go into the details of why that was a decision that the team stuck with, but we would encourage folks to visit the official developer website to learn more about the design decisions around why ordering matters and to learn more about modifiers in general. Now, from UX research perspective, the homework paradigm really worked out well. It allowed for more time for exploration. But one of the things we started to realize was, can we extend this 1 week duration of exploration to something more so that people are actually working on mini projects instead of like mini tasks that get assigned to them? So there is much more freedom on a participant in these research sessions to sort of pick a project that they want to work on, something that they can relate to in real world. And so we started to explore diary research as a paradigm for capturing return feedback on developer experiences over like longer periods of time, like around like 3 to 4 weeks, right? And we paired this again with like follow-up video calls that gave us the opportunity to have deeper conversations. Now we actually went back to evaluating modifiers again. We validated the changes that were made in our diary study, and we did hear positive feedback on the concept of chaining modifiers. So in this case here's a quote where we had a participant talk to us and tell us that it took a while for them to fully understand the power of modifiers, but they were able to get more comfortable using it further. And once they started chaining them together, it got much more powerful, and they were amazed that they were able to code in this manner with only one parameter. So there were indeed some friction points with discovery and knowing which modifier to use, and this is something that our team is actively working to tackle. And that's basically what we are thinking of in terms of like future considerations. Is in addition to those friction points, there are two high-level things that our team is actively considering. Now, most developers start slow, but they're able to sort of grasp the concept with practice, right? We are considering ways to reduce this kind of initial barrier. In addition, discovery is often paired with context. So we are exploring ways for improving this coding experience so that it can help developers rapidly find and use the most appropriate modifiers in their code. With that, I'm going to hand off to Chris to talk about the last story.
Thanks, Preethi. So the last story we'll talk about is how we designed the preview tools for Jetpack Compose and how developer feedback has influenced the design direction of that. So in Compose, this is just some text taken directly from our documentation, but to recap, the idea is that when you're building your UI in Compose, it's really a set of composable functions that take in data and then emit UI elements. And so this case is very simple. Greeting, which says hello, and you can pass whatever, and it says, in this case, it'll say hello world. One difference is, I think, unlike the XML-based approach, Compose expresses all the UI description and code and how to bind that data to the code all in Kotlin in a single file. And so from a UI building perspective, we want to think about, how might we provide a complementary experience to the Compose paradigm? And so next one. So the approach are 3 points here. I think the first one was, even though the Compose paradigm is different, we don't want to necessarily abandon some of the experiences that we built for XML. So things, we want to build upon that. And some of those things were like, developers really like the visual preview of XML with the code plus the preview. So we didn't want to lose that. But I think to that, we wanted to actually really embrace the editor as the canvas. And so we do have a drag and drop experience for XML, which is the layout editor. But I think with Compose, because it is all defined in Kotlin, we're thinking like, how can we really use the editor more as the designing experience versus this drag and drop experience? And then to the third one, we really wanted to optimize for iteration and experimentation. So, Compose is very new. And so one thing we found is like tools that help you learn and then keep you learning and in that flow allow you to just pick up things faster and it's just more enjoyable to even use the framework. And so with Compose, we wanted to build that into the approach to make it fun to actually use Compose and learn Compose while you're using Android Studio. And so this is kind of an animated video of how the experience works. But the idea is, as you edit code on the left, the preview gets updated on the right. So every preview is basically a composable function that's annotated with the preview annotation. But because it's all Kotlin, this actually really allows you to do more complex things because the thing you're looking at is actually compiled code. So whether you're doing data binding or business logic, or you have sample data, and then how that all relates to layout, it really gives you a much more realistic idea of what your UI will look like without actually needing to deploy to device. And this kind of goes to what we were saying before is this idea of leaning into code as a canvas. We had seen in previous research and even through telemetry that developers often, when they're using XML, there are many who use the drag and drop experience in the layout editor, but more often than not, a lot of people will just use the XML plus preview experience. And part of that is the speed in which you get it, but it's also just that familiarity with code versus mouse and keyboard in terms of like how you're constructing the UI. And so with Compose, we wanted to keep leaning into that and make the code the big driver of how you build the UI, not the mouse. So in some sense, taking that code as canvas idea and taking this preview annotation, you get this sort of UI REPL environment in Android Studio where we give you a lot of speed and flexibility as you iterate and experiment and learn through Compose. And then that just kind of reinforces itself as we go further. So with preview, it's very flexible, whether you're working on an entire flow in your app or you're working on a single button or component. So in this case, previews can be displayed in various configurations. So it makes it easy to see things side by side. In the example here, we have different screen sizes. So you can see the same layout. This is like a contacts example, but across 3 different widths. And then you can also see it in the dark theme as well. The next one. And so, in this case, you're actually looking at a couple of components and just the components in isolation. So the preview makes it easy to see kind of your design system. In this case, this is like status buttons. And so we think it's great for capturing state once, since often I think the pattern we want is that state is passed into each of your composable functions. And so in this case, it's easy to reflect that. And then, like I said before, you can test entire screens or single buttons. In this case, this is more of the traditional approach where you're just doing one screen at a time. In this case, this is like the Jet Snack sample. And in this screen, it's complex. It's not just, it's like a couple horizontal feeds, a filter button, search at the top, or a location actually. And so this is, oh yeah, it's fine. We can go to the next one. And so, kind of the recurring theme of this talk is like everything we show, we want to validate with developers how it's going. And so we did another study with this. I think Preethi had mentioned earlier about the diary studies that we had done for modifiers. So with Preview, we wanted to actually just opportunistically fold that research together because often in the diary studies, they were using the Preview tools to work through the examples. And so because that experience of using Preview as they were learning modifiers was so crucial to that experience and it was top of mind, we thought, we should just use the same participants and people that are already working on it. So it was iterative as before. And the idea or intent was to really just validate the current direction and then seek feedback on future ideas. And so the feedback we got, which I think is great feedback and resonates well with the design direction we want to go in, is that people really felt that it could help them rapidly prototype UIs. They felt like having that full power of Kotlin was great because, especially for sample data, you can easily pass it into preview functions. And this was always kind of an awkward experience with XML in the past where you had to use the tools attribute to do any kind of sample data to get your preview to look realistic. But with Compose and with Kotlin, that experience was much better for people. And then I think, again, to the iteration part and getting this REPL environment, deploying the preview, or having preview means you don't actually have to hook up the entire UI to see an actual flow. So there is a little button now in the preview where you can actually say, okay, taking this one component or one screen or whatever you annotated with the preview, you can deploy that directly to device. And the great part, as this quote says, is like you don't have to set a certain state or get into a specific context in order to test that. It just makes debugging and changing complex UI in your app easier, especially as your app grows. And so with that, the things we learned from the preview tools, there's just more things we want to do for the future. So one is code navigation. So when you're looking at a preview, sometimes it could be a single component, sometimes it could be a screen made of multiple components. And so navigating through the code is something that will become trickier as you start to grow out your app and have more and more composable functions. So we want to figure out from a tooling perspective how to make that easier as complexity grows. With testing, so we mentioned that deploying to device or the preview you have is easy, but the speed is not quite there yet, and so we want to make it even faster of an experience. Right now, our compiler is a little slow, so sometimes updating preview can be slow compared to previous experiences with XML, which is a lot more responsive. And so we just want to keep doing that because we want to continue to accelerate your workflows, especially when you're starting to test interactivity with your screens or animation. And then third exploration that we want to pursue is discovery. So Compose is new and it will continue to be new for many people. And there's a lot of APIs to learn and concepts in general. So how can we help you learn as you go within the tools? So in some cases, like you might know, like what is the right composable to use for this specific design problem that I'm trying to build? And so to summarize, going back to the framework that Preethi mentioned in the beginning about respecting the user, we walked through 3 examples that really covered, how we're approaching building intuitive APIs, usable tools, and also just useful docs or guidance in general. We hope through these stories that we've demonstrated that really developer research or UX research is really more than just testing the UI. It's really a combination of understanding how developers break down a problem and learn, and then how they perceive structuring their code, and then what tools can actually support them in this process as they go along. And so we still have a lot of work to do for Compose, and hopefully we will get to stable next year. But we're excited to continue on this journey with all of you, and just continue to shape Compose together as a community. So thank you. And so there's a sign up link here as well. So, the user studies we had mentioned earlier, if you want to sign up or, and be part of the community that's influencing Jetpack Compose, feel free to use the link below. And so now we will take questions.